little bit of housekeeping. If you need clarification on something I've just said or need me to expand further, please put that in the chat and Lynn will be monitoring those. But if there are other larger questions that you just want to discuss, we'll have some time at the end and we'll do that then, okay? All right, here we go. So this is a model of your brain, obviously, and we're gonna focus on 3 major areas of the brain when we talk about behavior. One is the brain stem, and then the limbic brain and the cortical region of the brain. Your brain stem, its sole responsibility is keeping you alive. So those are all autonomic systems, right? Your breathing, your temperature, your heart rate, your blood pressure, those kinds of things are all regulated by the brainstem. And your brainstem really, its job description says safety and protection. That's all it's there to do, is to keep you alive. The limbic brain is the emotional center of your brain, and that's what we look to your emotional self-regulation, your attachment systems, your reward systems, your arousal and sexual behavior. That all comes out of the limbic system, or the emotional feeling center of the brain. And then the neocortex and all the cortical region, the prefrontal, all of that is responsible for your abstract, cognitive, and reflective thinking. That's your thinking and processing part of your brain that's responsible for executive functioning. What we need to be aware of is our goal in any classroom setting, or actually in any social setting, is to ensure that we feel a sense of safety and belonging. So what you need to know is these strategies that we're going to talk about, as they create better and more secure environments for your learners, we are able to spend more time in the emotional and cognitive pieces of our brain and less time in trying to find safety, less time in that brain stem. So that is important for you to remember as we go forward with these conversations. Oops, sorry, wrong way. So state-based functioning is really critical for you to have a good grasp on. And this, it's important for you to know also that this is all people. This is 100% of the people that we deal with. This is human behavior, right? And it's based on those different places in the brain. But what it says is that we all operate in brain states that cause different kinds of behavior. So if you look all the way to the left, under calm, so that state is when you're sitting in your backyard under an umbrella, you have a glass of lemonade, you're reading a good book, and there's not a care in the world, right? Your body is at rest, your mind is at rest, and it's a very calm place. It's where you're in your head, you're in a thinking and abstract place, and that's just a good space to be in. The interesting thing about that is that's not where we want our learners. We want our learners to be in the state, one state to the right, and that is in the state of being aroused, being attentive, being alert. And that's because that's where most of the good learning takes place, right? So when you're in that state, you're vigilant, you're ready, you are receptive to new learning. It's in your cortex, but it's also in your limbic, because you're making connections as you're learning, and you're able to process things concretely. The interesting thing about that is your optimal learning zone, but you really are going to absorb about 80% of what's happening. So it's just like today when I'm talking to you. You could be feeling like you're very attentive to what I'm saying, but your brain will check out for a second and say, do I remember that? Do I connect to that? Do I believe that? What experience do I have with that? And that's a brain function. You have no control over that. And then it'll check back into what I'm saying. So you may have missed some information in the interim. This still is considered the optimal learning zone. So it's important to know that all of your learners at the very maximum are really going to get 80% of what you said. That's why multimodal, putting things out in auditory, visual, kinesthetic ways help with that piece. Here's the problem. If you are a young person or an adult that is living with chronic stress or has experienced trauma, or you're not just in that place of safety, you have moved one place to the right into alarm. Once you're in alarm, Your fight, flight, freeze reflexes are present. You are in your limbic and midbrain, which is bordering on your brain stem, which means you are in this place, right? The important thing about that is once you get there, your maximum absorption of information is at 40%. So think about what that means for the learners in your classroom. What if they're in a place of safety and alert and attention when you're teaching content, and then they have test anxiety? So they go into this alarm state the minute the test comes out. They are not going to be able to produce what you already know they know. So that's really important to keep in mind. And that's for all students, but kids with trauma live here. They live in this alarm place. They aren't at an attentive arousal place. They very rarely, if ever, get to calm. So just know that about your learners, if they experience chronic stress, or if they are students who have experienced trauma, they're living in that alarm place. They may even be living in the two spaces to the right, which are fear and terror. In those places, the learning is I mean, the cortical region has handed the keys over to the brainstem, and that's basically what's driving them at that point. So that's really important to remember in your teaching and learning, and why kids, once you've been in it for a while, some of you may have already experienced, we sat together yesterday and you could do this, how come you can't do it today? And that is part of this response. So this is a couple different pictures of brain development. And the one on the left is typical development. And the message to get from this slide is our brain allocates resources according to need. So a typically developing young person, and by the way, in your everyday life as an adult as well, doesn't have to be just from development, your brain is going to allocate resources according to what you need. So if you are not a person who is living with chronic stress, if you're not a person who is living in a traumatic environment or experiencing traumatic things, very little of your brain's resources need to go towards survival. The majority of your resources in your brain can go towards cognition and your social emotional relationships, your connectivity and all that with other people, and your ability to regulate. But very little has to go towards safety. But if you are one of those people who live with chronic stress or live in trauma or have been raised in those environments, then your brain feels like it's always needs to be in safety mode. So that's where the resources go. Your energy, your brain, your cognition, there's very little left for cognition. It's going towards your survival and your self-regulation. So that's another thing that's important to know when you're working with adults or students who are experiencing chronic stress or trauma. This slide is pretty important for a couple reasons, and that is we want learners, learning happens in an optimal arousal zone, and that's that zone right down the middle. That's when you are comfortable in your social interactions, you are feeling safe and able to explore, to take risks, all of those things. That is your optimal arousal zone. That's where we want our learners to live. Those of us who don't experience chronic stress, have not experienced traumatic situations or environments, that's where we primarily live, and that's where our neural pathways keep us, right? We are comfortable in that place. That is our zone. That's our window of tolerance. Sometimes there will be something that pushes us up into that hyper arousal. Sometimes there's something that occurs that pushes us down into that hypo arousal. In hyperarousal, there's increased emotional reactivity, hypervigilance, all of those things. In hypoarousal, that's the numbing. That's our hoodie hiders that put their hoodies up and put their heads down on their desk. That's that hypoarousal. But if we operate normally in that window, that optimal arousal zone, sometimes we're up, sometimes we're down, but because the neural pathways are carved for us into that optimal window, that's where we're comfortable. That's where we stay most of the time. We return to once an event has passed. Our young people and our adults who experience chronic stress and trauma live in either hyper or hypoarousal. And it takes a ton of energy and focus and effort to get up into or down into that optimal arousal zone. So that piece is critical to know. They are expending so much energy just to be in your classroom where they need to be, that again, that safety reflex, there's not a lot left for cognition. Okay. So think about that. What does that mean for the behavior you might see in your classroom? And I would love it if somebody wants to unmute, or if you just want to put it in the chat. But knowing the brain's responsibility for reactivity, what does that mean for your kids in your classroom? Anybody want to share? Anything in the chat, Lynn? No? Okay. So that's okay. What that means is that when kids are acting out or shutting down, there may or may not be any control on their part. It may be the function of a brain seeking safety and seeking to protect that young person or that adult. This can be in adult interactions as well. So we have to help them with the skills and tools to self-regulate. And if they can't do that, we need to know the tools and skills so that we can co-regulate with them until they can. So let's talk about some of the tools to help young people self-regulate. Oops, sorry. So these strategies that I'm going to share with you right now are fabulous for 100% of your learners in your classroom. This should be daily practice, right? This should be part of what you do. Baby animal pictures. So if you have your phone right now, you could do it, but otherwise you can do it later. If you Google baby animal pictures, that's what you get, baby animal pictures. And you will also, if you do that in a room and you ask your students to do that, if you're allowing cell phones, all of a sudden you'll hear, oh, look how cute. And they'll start to share and they smile and there's laughter and things like that. You can't be in this safety and protective mode of your brain and that nurturing cognitive part of your brain at the same time. So it helps to pull you into that cognitive part of your brain. So if I were still teaching, when you walked into my classroom, you would see baby animal pictures up on my screen every day, because it would allow students to let go of whatever muck and yuck happened before they entered your classroom, get them setting the stage for optimal learning conditions. That's hugely helpful. There's also some research done by a person named Amy Cuddy, and what she researched was body posture. And so one of her tips and tricks is this, and you can practice this with me if you want to, you don't have to, but if you put your hands behind your head and stick your feet out in front of you and cross your ankles and hold that pose for 2 minutes, the chemistry in your blood says that you increase your testosterone, which testosterone gives you feelings of power and energy, and you decrease the cortisol in your blood. Cortisol is the stress hormone, and that's what helps kick in that brainstem activity that says you need to make sure I'm safe. So if I were teaching, again, before high stakes testing, I would do this. Before your students had to stand in front of the class to give a class speech, I would do this. Anytime there was something that could potentially be stressful, this is what I would have them be doing. Everybody's heard a million times, go to your happy place, right? That is legit. So if you can create a picture in your mind of some place that is calm for you, that is peaceful, that makes you happy, and really focus on that mental imagery. What does it look like there? What does it sound like? What would I smell? What would I taste? What would I feel? And really practice that in your head. Then when you're in a stressful situation, you really can take yourself to that happy place, and it's self-regulating. So that's another skill to teach your students and for you to be aware of as well. Breathing and rhythmic movement is hugely important in regulation, and it can help kids get ready for their day in school, but it can also help regulate. So you'll hear that as a theme throughout, that breathing and rhythmic movement are critical. In through the nose, out through the mouth, rhythmic movement, any kind. Um, um, Headphones with music with some beat to it, rocking, basketballs, squeezy toys, fidget spinners, all those are rhythmic that help regulate a young person or an adult. So that is just general universal practices that are good for all learners. And by the way, as we move forward, all of these practices that I will tell you and all these tips and tricks are good for everyone, 100% of the students in your classroom. These, though, really just focus on creating safety and belonging and relationships in your classroom. And doing that, setting that stage for a safe environment, builds a student's capacity to regulate and allows them to move out of that safety place of their brain into the more thinking functions of their brain. Greatest strategy, super simple. I would recommend that you do this with 100% of your students throughout your school year, but start with those kids who really struggle with their emotional self-regulation, and that is the 2x10 strategy. What that is that you commit to 2 minutes every single day for 10 days with one student. And during those 2 minutes, there's no academic talk, there's no grades, behavior, any of that, no school talk. You are just talking to a young person about anything they want to talk about. You're getting to know that person. Who lives in your home? Be really careful with asking about family, because family means different things to different people. Who lives in your home? What do you like to do when you're not in school? Do you have pets? Those kinds of things. That's what happens in that 2x10 strategy. And I'll tell you what, it is magical. Because what happens is that person gets the feeling that you're a safe person, that you care about them personally, and it changes the whole feeling of safety and belonging within your school community, your classroom community. So that's a great strategy and super simple. Everything you do, you want to be setting the stage for safety. And safety means physical safety, emotional safety, and identity safety. Identity safety means I can be who I am in your classroom, and not only am I accepted, but I'm celebrated for what I bring to the diversity of the fabric of the community, right? That's identity safety. It's not just that I'm not going to get teased, it's that I'm going to be celebrated for who I am. Critical to the culture and climate of your classroom and the safety and belonging. Obviously, physical safety, that's important, but emotional safety also means that I know you as a teacher are never going to humiliate me and embarrass me, right? You are always going to be in relationship with me and protecting my feelings, my emotional safety. One of the things that I hear a ton is teachers, especially secondary teachers, and I get it, that have 150 kids in a year saying, I don't have time to build relationships with all my kids. I'm going to say two things. One is, yes, you do. And two is, you don't have time not to. But the reason I'll tell you that you do is because what relationship means in this context is always responding with empathy, dignity, and respect. And you can do that because you're going to respond one way or another. If you respond with empathy, that creates safety, and it creates community, and it creates belonging. So as long as you are always responding with empathy, respect, and dignity, you are creating relationships with all of those people. They may not invite you to your wedding, but to their wedding, but that's okay. What you want to do is create the conditions for learning and for connection in your classroom. Routines and rituals are hugely important for all students, but particularly those kids who operate under chronic stress and trauma. If they know what's coming, it creates safety, right? And so when you have to break routines and rituals, which you do frequently, just make sure they know that. It's a support for that transition. Remember that today is the assembly. So we won't be doing this, we'll be doing this. But the more those things are anticipated, the more they know what happens every day at each time in your classroom, the more safety there is. Another theme that you'll hear throughout this presentation is about mindfulness and brain breaks and movement. I talked about that already. You can be watching your classroom do a slow boil And if you've been in the classroom, you know what I'm talking about. As soon as that happens, you should be doing a brain break or a movement break. Okay, everybody stand up, do some kind of cross midline things, and GoNoodle.com is a fabulous place to find those little activities, and they have videos for your thing. But just some kind of movement or breathing, literally 10 seconds, 20 seconds, then back in your seats. What you've done is you've helped regulate those students who are struggling to self-regulate, but you've also oxygenated all of the brains of the students in your classroom, so better learning is going to happen anyway.
Cathy, can I jump in for a second?
Please.
Erica had a great suggestion. She's one of our music teachers that's with us today, and we have a couple. And she suggested that you talk to the music teacher in your building, that they're all aware of great breathing exercises and rhythmic movements, posture, all that good stuff. So there's a resource that hadn't occurred to me, but an excellent suggestion.
Excellent resource. And also your PE person. Bring your PE person into your classroom and just tell them you need literally like 30-second regulation strategies. They're learning about all that in their teacher preparation. Great ideas. Thanks for that. The more you can create a culture of safety and belonging in your classroom, the better. If you don't know about restorative practices, that's a movement as well. It has to do somewhat with discipline, but only a very small piece. It has to do with creating community and creating a group of learners who care about each other and what they think about each other, and that helps to regulate behavior. So things like community building circles, when a student's struggling, a one-on-one away from everybody restorative chat instead of out loud where everybody can hear it, those kinds of things. Again, my secondary friends who say I don't have time to do this. My husband is a secondary math interventionist, and he doesn't even have the full amount of time that most classroom teachers have. And he starts every day with a circle coming in and a circle closing down. And what it does is just set the stage for learning. It gets them in a learning brain. It releases some of the stress, puts them in a safe place, and they can move forward and learn better. So just those couple minutes. And once they get into a routine, literally he can do an opening circle and a closing circle in 2 minutes each. So you can do it. It takes practice and time, but the return on that investment of time is pretty fabulous. And I did talk about building a culture that celebrates diversity. All of these things that we talked about here are great topics for community building circles, by the way. So that's just setting the stage, right? That is creating the space for optimal learning. You're going to have in the moments when a kid, a group of kiddos, an adult, whatever, are in a dysregulated state, and you're seeing acting out or the shutting down behavior, one or the other. If you look at this list of responses in the moment and they're labeled as ineffective, when I went to school 30 years ago, this is what we were taught for classroom management. It's still being taught for classroom management, these kinds of things. Talking about better choices, making better choices, using point charts, excluding, quite frankly, you need to leave my classroom. Those kinds of things, all of those things are not necessarily in and of themselves ineffective strategies, but they're ineffective in the moment. When a student is dysregulated, these won't help you. And that goes back to those first slides we talked about. There is no cognition happening. And if you're asking them to make a better choice, you're asking them to be in a cognitive space, and they're not, and they can't. If you're promising them a reward, if you pull it together, I'll give you 5 minutes extra recess. That's like, you're all probably too young to remember Peanuts. The teacher went, wah, 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 wah. That's what's happening in that moment because there's no cognition. So while these aren't bad strategies in and of themselves, they will do the opposite. They'll have the opposite effect if you have a student in the moment in dysregulation. What is effective are these things. Leveraging your relationship and validating and accepting their response. Saying to a young person, oh, you know what, this must really suck for you. This must be really hard for you. I care about you and I'm going to help you through this, right? When you're ready, we'll talk through this. And I will help you. Critically important that you are accepting and validating their feelings. That creates safety and helps bring them back together. Non-threatening body language, reducing your power differential. If you're standing over them, if you're pointing, if your arms are crossed, those kinds of things, they will create a narrative in their heads regardless, right? So if you have a furrowed brow, which I have to really be careful, because when I'm listening, I cross my arms and furrow my brow, they will create the narrative that says she's angry with me, she doesn't like me. So really being conscious of that, open body posture, no real affect on your face, those kinds of things are important. The empathy and understanding. Again, if you have the opportunity for self-regulating behavior, peace corners, we're starting to hear about that. That's fabulous. It's a place for kids to chill, or the adult in the room if they need it. But some rhythmic stuff in their headphones, squeezy balls, things like that, that all helps to regulate. Anchoring is also hugely important. That means you're going to be with that kid. You're going to say, you are a part of this community. We care about you, and we're going to get through this. We listened to a fabulous speaker named Larry Thompson, and you can look him up. And he talked about having a plan B in his classroom. And something hugely important about this to know is you can't do this on the spur of the moment, right? This has to be part of your classroom routine that you've taught. All kids know how to respond to plan B. And what that says is, friends, we're a community here, and sometimes people get angry, upset, afraid. And we have to have a way that I, as the adult, can spend some time to help that child regulate. So you have a plan B. And some of these classrooms have a plan B folder that's right under their chairs that have like a content relevant crossword puzzle, an article to read, something like that, that when the teacher says, folks, we're going to go into plan B because I'm going to help this group of kids or this young person for a minute, kids know exactly what to do. They pull out their folders. There may be even in his classroom, he had a plan B leader, and that kind of was a job that moved around, but that person had extra whatevers if somebody didn't have what they needed for plan B. But that gave that teacher time to either pull the kid out of the class and help them regulate, or sit with them and do some breathing and some regulation. Fabulous strategy. Again, it has to be set up. It's not something you can just do kind of on the spur of the moment. But it's things like that, anything that creates safety, that say, hey, making mistakes is part of learning, so are emotions, and we accept that and we honor that and we support that. That's what is going to make your classroom mitigate as much of the acting out or shutting down behavior as possible. And so those are some effective strategies for that. So another thing that's critically important is we don't ignore behavior. I'm not asking you ever to ignore behavior or to not have consequences for behavior. I'm also not asking you to never exclude a young person from your classroom. There may be times that behavior is so explosive or so disruptive that they have to be removed. Here's what I'm asking you. Build relationships and safety on a regular basis with your class so that they're part of a community. If that happens and they have to be excluded, they know they're going to be welcomed back. When you are going through that, where you're excluding, you're saying to that young person, I care about you, I want you here, but you're unsafe right now. So I need you to, hopefully you have this all planned out too. Go to your buddy classroom, go to the office, whatever. But sometimes exclusion is necessary. I get it. Use it as minimally as possible and only when absolutely necessary, because you do have to then repair the relationship, right? But after the moment, it's important that you process through what just occurred with the young person. The very most critical piece of this is it has to be on their time frame. And when you think again, back to the brain slides, it makes perfect sense. If they're still in a place where they're totally dysregulated and there's no thinking happening, they are not in a place to process their emotions and what just happened. So you would say to a young person, you know what? Why don't you take 5 minutes in the peace corner at your desk, put your head down, whatever your plan is, and I'm going to check with you and see if you're ready in 5 minutes. And then check with them. And if they're still like, no, I'm not going to, then you know they're not ready. And you say, okay, I'm going to be back in 3. If they are ready, then you need to have the time to sit and process with them either out in the hall or in a private setting. Maybe you do your plan B again. But you want to help the student process through the event. You also want to be very honest with them about what that behavior looks like and does from other people's perspective. Because sometimes they're missing that piece, that empathy piece that allows them to see others' perspectives. And you want them to understand their impact of their behavior. So obviously you're not taking a blame stance or anything else, but you're saying, let me tell you what it looked like from their point of view. It frightened them when you started to yell and slammed your hand down and they couldn't learn anymore. They need to know the impact of their behavior. It just has to be done in a way that you're expressing empathy. Then you rebuild the community. They need to be entered back in. That doesn't mean you make them stand in front and apologize or write an apology letter. It also doesn't mean that if you are a circle person, that a circle is ever about an individual student. The way for them to enter back into the community is with all the things that you've built beforehand that says we are a community that cares about each other. If you want to use behaviors in general as part of your community building circle, then you talk about what do you do when you're angry or upset to get yourself back into a learning mode. So you talk about solutions, and that removes the blame and the discomfort for that young person. Okay? Again, reassure safety. You're safe here. We care about you. We're going to do everything we can as a community to make everyone feel safe and accepted. And you reaffirm your relationship. You're important to me. And your safety and your comfort here is important to me. Those are all really critical pieces. So we just talked a lot about why we have to have strategies to set the stage for learning, and why we have to have strategies both in the moment and after the moment, and effective strategies that don't require a lot of cognition. Here's a really important fact. If I am dysregulated as an adult, I can't help that kid who's dysregulated. It's going to go badly, right? It's going to end badly. So the rest of this presentation, we're going to talk about things that you can do that can help yourself regulate in order to help your students regulate. Know that all of the things that we just talked about are self-regulating for everyone. They're self-regulating for the adults in the system. They're self-regulating for kids who have experienced trauma, who haven't, stressed, not all those things. They're good self-regulating strategies that have helped you as well. But there are some additional things that you can and should do as the adult in the classroom to help further that self-regulation. And then you'll be ready when the crisis hits. Uh-oh, is this right? Did I go in the right order? Okay, so Viktor Frankl, this guy here, was a Holocaust survivor. And he wrote the book, Man's Search for Meaning. And he talks about that space between stimulus and response, and that's where our power lies and where our decision lies. And so looking at this stage, or excuse me, at this slide, you think about you're teaching, you're having a wonderful time, you've built a fabulous lesson, and you walk by a student and you hear them say, "This freaking sucks." And they've said it under their breath. Maybe the kids next to them have heard it, maybe they haven't, whatever. There is that space where that red arrow is. And that space is how you choose to respond, right? So I can respond by going, "What did you say?" And then I promise you it's game on, and they will win because they have to, because you've put them in a position where they have to save face now. Everybody in the classroom's looking, going, "Ooh, wonder what she's going to do, wonder what the student's going to do," right? She or he, sorry, either way. And so if you do that, you're in a power struggle, and adults never win power struggles. It's just the fact of the matter. However, if you are walking around the classroom and you can place a hand on the shoulder and say, "You and I'll visit later," or if you can just say, "I understand you're upset. I'm sorry about that. I'll connect with you in a minute, but I need to finish this lesson," then everybody in the room knows that it's not going unchecked, right? but it's also a dignified and respectful way to respond to misbehavior. And then you have the chance to breathe, and then you can follow through with that young person afterwards, right? So just know anytime there's a stimulus, and it doesn't have to be as extreme as somebody dropping the F-bomb in your classroom. It can be the hoodie hiding, right? It can be the checking out. You need to have that space to decide how you're going to respond, make sure it's with dignity and empathy, and that it's preserving relationship. So some self-regulation tips for adults. It's critically important that you always model your thinking. I said it before, kids will create a narrative in their head. So if your body language looks angry, that's what they're going to put in their minds. So create safety by saying what you're thinking, modeling, sharing what you're thinking. I am angry right now. That I worked really hard on that lesson plan, and I'm angry. I need to self-regulate. So I'm just going to breathe for a little bit. Please take out a book, sit quietly. Or I'm just going to take a few deep breaths and then I'll be ready to move forward. Or let's get up and do some stretches. Or let's circle up. Let's share some strategies we use when we're really frustrated and angry. But say it, put it out there, model it. Because they need to know, number one, that emotions happen to everybody, and you're human as the teacher. Emotions happen to you as well. They need to know that it's normal, and they also need to know your strategies to fix it. How do you help yourself when you're dysregulated? As you talk about your strategies and model them, kids are building strategies, and they're building a new toolbox of how to respond when they're frustrated. Movement, again, I'm just going to walk a little bit. I'm going to, whatever. We're all going to get up and we're going to do some walking, or we're going to do some jumping jacks. I know teachers who are doing yoga in their classrooms. Get out your mats, those kinds of things. Model breathing for them, but honor and validate your own feelings as well. I'm frustrated, and that's okay. As human beings, we get frustrated, and sometimes it's not within our control. I just need a minute to re-regulate. And then again, don't respond to misbehavior in the moment. There's a whole study on mirror neurons that says, as I escalate, you escalate. And it just happens. It's not within our control. But if we as adults have strategies, we can re-regulate, which also helps re-regulate the student. So just don't respond in the moment. Take a deep breath, tell them you need a minute, and then process later. Okay, we are doing great on time, I think. Am I right, Lynn? Okay, good. So we'll have lots of time for discussion. One last thing that I would be really remiss if I didn't share with you is the importance of being aware of your exposure to trauma. You may have your own traumatic background. You may be operating with chronic stress. But even if you're not, hearing the stories of the young people in your care and understanding their trauma and their stress will rub off on you. It's not a when, if, it's a when, and it's a to what extent. And it's sometimes called secondary trauma, it's called compassion fatigue, it's called caregiver trauma, but just what happens to you as being the recipient of those stories causes this to happen. Another thing is you are in a stressful job. This is tough stuff. This is not for the lightweights, right? In 2017, the American Federation of Teachers did a survey of, it was like 17,000 teachers or something like that. It was this large scale study. And 61% said they were always or often stressed about work. Another 30% said sometimes. So that means 91% of our teaching staff are at least sometimes, if not often and always stressed. That's huge. And some of the things that they indicated were student behavior, relationships with families, and then there was initiative fatigue and those other things. Another study from the National Teacher Principal Survey, 2015-16 data, said that 44% of new teachers leave the profession within 5 years. We have to find ways to get that under control. We're losing really good people, and we're losing them because of stress. So it's critically important that you're aware of those two things, the stress that comes with the job, vicarious, secondary, traumatic stress, all of those things. And then we're taking care of ourselves. If you've been on an airplane, you've heard, please put your oxygen mask on yourself first before helping others. We have to do that. Self-care is critical to our survival in this very important role that you're in. So put your oxygen mask on first means have a self-care plan, and don't leave it up to chance. Don't say, well, I go home at night, I take a hot bath, I read a book. Have a plan. This is what I do every day to let go of the stress from work and move into my home environment, so I'm not bringing it there. This is what I need to do for my own self-care. The other thing is, generally when people talk about self-care, and Lynn's done a lot of research about this, it's talking about what you do when you get home. There are things that you can and should be doing when you're at school to be taking care of your self-care. And part of it is the regulation stuff we just talked about. If you're breathing, if you're moving, if you are creating safe environments and you're talking about emotions, those are all self-care strategies. So make sure you have a plan for at work as well as at home for how you're taking care of the caregiver.